Good afternoon and welcome. This is the 2001 Richard Dunn Memorial Interview. This keynote session at the festival was established in 1999 in memory of the former chairman of Thames Television and has previously featured Greg Dyke, Simon Cowell and Jimmy Mulville. Today, we will explore the personal business vision, the creative strategy and the management style of Jon Thoday, Managing Director of Avalon. Jon is the son of an evolutionary scientist at Cambridge University, and indeed those who've negotiated talent deals with Jon might say that he pushes the idea of survival of the fittest just a bit far on occasions. Following in his father's footsteps, Jon studied genetics at Cambridge and went on to gain an MSc in genetic engineering at UCL. But even during his student days, Jon was already producing musicals. He asked Cameron Mackintosh for a job, but Mackintosh, perhaps sagely with hindsight, advised him to go it alone. So, along with his business partner, Richard Allen Turner, who Jon rescued from being Ents manager at East London Poly, he founded Avalon. It has grown to be one of the most successful talent agencies in the country, representing stars from Al Murray and Lee Mack to Fiona Bruce and Christine Blakely, not to mention Harry Hill and Frank Skinner. More controversially, perhaps, Avalon also promotes live events and produces TV shows, leading some to say that if Jon Thoday was that powerful in America, it would be illegal. So, Jon, let's start at the top. How do you respond to that view? And that's a direct quote from someone in the industry, that an organisation which both represents the talent, produces the talent, and promotes it live is dangerously conflicted.
Well, I think that the conflict thing often comes up, but ultimately, I think in show business, there are lots of conflicts. So if you're taking, a manager who produces, you can say there's a conflict, whether it be because you're representing the artist or because you're working for the broadcaster. But ultimately, you're looking to do a good show. So what you're thinking is, what's the best way to do a good show? And I believe that the manager-talent model works really well. It's worked very well for us, it's worked well for broadcasters, and it's worked in America. So you've got the manager-talent thing, but also broadcasters have a conflict of interest in that the broadcasters who own production companies, I would say that a broadcaster should choose absolutely from a level playing field what shows they might commission. If they own a business which is producing television and say the chief executive if it's a public company says our production company's got to make more TV shows, there's a tendency that people will try and make that happen rather than necessarily look for the best product. So, what I've always tried to do is basically look for something that's good and see if I can make it happen. And we evolved what we do simply from that point of view. So when we started a production company, we'd become frustrated because we either found that we'd go to the BBC with, at that time, in-house was sort of perhaps in decline, and you couldn't get the show commissioned because perhaps there was an older generation who kind of were very powerful, so you couldn't actually even get to the people that were commissioning, so getting into the controllers. So if you went in-house, there was all sorts of baggage floating around. Or if you went to an independent, so like Hat-Trick were sort of established before us, and they were very, very successful. But if you went to Hat-Trick with an idea, they would have a very, very long development slate and the chance of getting your product through. So we just developed it. We didn't sort of premeditate the idea that it would be successful. We just were trying to say, so David Baddiel rang me up and said, look, I thought about doing fantasy football. It seemed like a really original idea. I went to Alan Yentob and I persuaded David and Frank that perhaps we should have a go at producing it ourselves. And the reason for that was because I thought we might be able to make it happen. So there is a conflict or a potential conflict, but ultimately it's something which has worked not just for us, but for lots of people. And in fact, the American industry is based on it.
But if you, but if you represent the talent, if you manage the talent in the program, and you're also the producer of the program, and you have to tell the talent to do something perhaps that they don't want to do, or how do you? What are the means by which you manage, as it were, looking after their best interests and looking after the best interests of the programme, which is presumably what the broadcaster would pay you to do as the producer?
Well, my view is that the best interests of the programme are both the broadcaster's interests and the artist's interest. Because
but they don't always see it that way, do they?
No, they don't. No, I mean, it doesn't always work. You know, the fact is that there's all sorts of things that can go wrong with a television show, whether you are managing the artist or whether you're not. So if you're not managing an artist, then you're still bothered about keeping the artist happy. And actually, you can have a situation where somebody who's producing a show doesn't fully know the inner workings of an artist, and comedy in particular is very suited to the manager-producer model, because the distance between the idea for a joke and the screen is a very, very long one. The distance between the screen and success is even longer. And, you know, take a show like Not Going Out, which we produce. It took 5 controllers of BBC One to get to the point where there wasn't a danger of cancellation, right? Whereas our relationship with the artist who originated it goes back 18 years. So we know a lot about how to navigate. I'm not saying it always works, it doesn't, but then lots of TV shows flop. If you look at, you know, you can do 20 shows and they'll flop. None of them might be produced by the manager, some of them might be, so I don't think it's...
What about, okay, let's look at it from a different angle. What about when you're managing a client and therefore you're responsible for developing the client's career, comedian say, and I'm just interested to know, you know, how this works, that a producer approaches you with what they think is a great idea. Let's assume it is a great idea. Yeah? They own the rights to it. They're like your talent, who's a auteur talent, maybe a writer-performer. Yeah. At what stage do you stop being a producer in those circumstances? I mean, or
I think.
How does the talent know that you're not turning down great stuff because you can't produce it?
Because we don't do that, and they trust us to the extent that any artist can trust somebody. So because we're interested in their long-term success, turning down something because you can't produce it when the artist could benefit from it, would just be a stupid thing to do. You know, I'm not saying that people don't do that. I think people have copied us, and I think people do that. But it's something we really massively guard against. It's actually where your mindset is. So if you're managing a presenter, right, who may or may not think of ideas, right, what you're looking for is you're looking for a very broad spectrum of ideas to be brought to you, and you're hoping, frankly, for the idea where you think, if they host that, that's going to take them to the top, right? If you manage someone who originates ideas, so if you're managing a writer-performer, which is where we started, then you're always thinking, here's an idea, how do we get that produced, and how do we get it produced well, and I believe in the end, how do we get rewarded in success? So the answer is, there isn't a magic formula beyond the fact that we're looking at wanting to have very long-term relationships with people. And if you look at our track record, we've sort of navigated through the industry. So if you take Frank's career to a certain extent, it was, I mean, you were a part of it, in that he originated on Channel 4. He did a few shows which didn't work. And then he made an appearance on Have I Got News For You, which he was at the beginning of Have I Got News For You. He was incredibly funny against, you know, a difficult climate for a comedian, and that led to a deal with the BBC when you were there. And that led ultimately to the success of the Frank Skinner show and fantasy football, and then we went to ITV partly because of your enthusiasm. So I think there's lots of advantages to what we do. It can be very difficult. It doesn't always work, and some artists it's not suited to, because they get kind of worried, you know, about whether they are being advised right. And often people will say to them that they're not, right? But I think if you go back and you look at our track record, we've had a lot of success doing it like that.
But I'm just pushing this a little bit further, and then we'll move on. If you, I'm just interested in a sense, of course, I understand the client's going to have to trust you, but what if they come to you with an idea you think isn't very good? I mean, what if it's one of your clients who's very well established?
Yeah.
Right, and they say, this is what I really want to do next.
Yes.
Now, if you are not producing, if you have nothing other interest in that client other than, as it were, getting them work.
Yes.
I'm interested in,
well,
where you draw the line when you say to them, "Guy, I'm sorry, Frank, that's a terrible idea."
Well, you know, an example, I suppose, of that is, I believe we would say that. So we do shows at the Edinburgh Festival. Artists come to us every year and they say, "I want to do this." And I remember Al Murray wanting to bring the pub landlord to Edinburgh, and his manager said, "I don't think you should go this year, it's not ready." And that's a difficult conversation to have, but you have to be prepared to have those conversations because you have to think about the long term. If you make a short-term decision, it often comes back to bite you. There is a risk in that if you're just an agent, because if you tell a successful artist that something is a bad idea, there's a chance they will sack you. I recall Rob Newman, who I'd never once had an argument with, he fell out with David and they'd stopped working together, and I remember him coming and saying, "I'm going to write a feature film," and it was called Dig for Victory.
What for victory?
Dig for Victory.
Dig for Victory.
I read the script and it was quite a good idea, but appalling. I mean, it needed another writer with it. So I said to him, "Look, if I send this out, I think it's going to damage your career." And the next day, I got a letter from him sacking me. Right, and that was the only. I never even had an argument with him, actually. I just got a letter saying, "I don't want you anymore." I discovered some years later, he went to Michael Foster, who's sort of a well-known agent, who was not a producer, and in fact, an agent running ICM at the time. And it turned out that Michael had told Rob that script was the best thing he'd ever written. And about 3 years later, I found out he never read it. So I think, and he's an agent, great agent, incredibly good negotiator, good at winding up artists and like poaching them from companies, but he didn't have any conflicts. He just wanted the client. So I just think in the end that there's lots of ways of attacking people. In the end, if you're trying to do something good, that's the best you can do. And there are problems with it, you know. But there are problems like if you have someone who... I often am frustrated when I see an artist being produced by another company, and actually you can get a situation where the producer of the show, if they're not experienced, and it's increasingly hard to find experienced producers, will say to an artist, "Yeah, that's great," when it's not, right? And actually, if you know the artist really well, you can have those conversations. There's lots of ways of doing it, and that's part of the job. And it is one of the risks of management, you know.
Okay, right. Well, let's take you back to, as it were, the beginnings of your career and to those days just after university, and you were looking for. And you studied genetics. Your father was an academic, but you chose to head towards show business. Where do you think that came from? I mean, it just seems quite a leap.
Well, I liked television comedy when I grew up. I used to watch mainly on the BBC all the things that everyone would always quote, you know, the Two Ronnies, etc. I loved that, and I occasionally went to see shows at the Arts Theatre in Cambridge and enjoyed it. And I don't know where it came from, really. I just loved the idea of entertaining the public. So
there's no question after you'd done your masters that you would not go into academia, but you would go into show business.
No, I was heading for academia probably, but to be honest, decided I wasn't very good at it. And what I really wanted to do is put shows on. And I thought I had a moment when someone said to me, "Is that what you're going to do?" And I thought about it, and I thought, actually, if I don't do that in 20 years' time, I might really regret not having had a go.
But at that stage, you wanted to put on shows. You weren't saying, "I want to represent talent. I want to develop comedians."
No, I just wanted to produce. Actually,
right.
I'd seen, you know, I remember going up to London and seeing Guys and Dolls at the National or whatever it was, and that I'd seen shows that I thought were well produced. And I thought that's what I want to do.
So you went to see Cameron McIntosh?
Yes. And I wrote to the only two producers I thought at the time. I admired Cameron McIntosh and admired Michael White. Michael had an eclectic kind of taste, and Cameron McIntosh obviously was So I thought the only job I really want to do in show business is work for one of the two best producers. And I went for interviews with both of them Cameron Mackintosh said, no, I'm not going to give you a job because you'll probably go and do it yourself. So I don't really think it's appropriate, so why don't you go and have a go? So.
But in fact, did you have a go at producing theatre, or did you go...
No, I started by producing theatre. Right. I was interested in new writing, and so I started looking for scripts that were, and I had no money at all, and I was just and I tried ringing agents and said, look, and they sent me script, but they wouldn't ever send a decent script out, right? They were always pretty poor, right? And because I had, my view then was, because I didn't know anybody in entertainment or showbiz, I thought they just sell to their friends, and therefore they're sending me something from the very bottom drawer, because frankly it was from the bottom drawer. So then I just tried to find plays to produce, really, that were new, and it was very tough to do that.
But you did find something, didn't you? And you did get something on in the West End.
Well, the first thing I did was we brought a show called Mumbo Jumbo, which was MGEITF's first commercial venture. We brought that to London. And then I produced a musical, which was spectacularly unsuccessful, right? And lost £402,000. A show called Nightclub Confidential, which was, it sang without trace.
So, but...
To be honest.
But you lost £402,000, which means not presumably that you personally lost £402,000, but the backers that you persuaded to back this great musical lost £402,000.
Well, we raised, I worked with somebody else who was raising the money. We raised around £200,000, and we were heading for the show opening, and we still were £200,000 short, and in fact, the person I was working with sort of disappeared over the hills at that point. Right? In the end, what I did was I bought 30,000 names of rich people and stuffed the envelopes and sent envelopes out, and we raised the rest of the money like that. So,
and when you were looking down that tunnel and raising this extra 200,000, I mean, this was a few years ago.
It was terrifying. I honestly
really
thought
scary.
I was going bankrupt.
Okay. But at that stage, you were absolutely confident that this was going to be a hit, were you?
No.
But then it was rather foolhardy thing to do.
No, it was completely foolhardy, but I had to pay the bills. I learned a lot from doing that, because if you're a producer and you don't produce something, then you can't pay any bills. I had no money at all. So and what happens is that
this is turnover for your nascent production
I thought
business.
There was a chance it might work, right? And we were, the truth is, I think that's why people have purple patches, is your judgment is much better in a purple patch than one where, if you have like lots of flops in a row, you start going, well, maybe the next one, maybe that's all right? Whereas actually, if you're having a lot of success, it becomes much easier to sort of make the right decisions. And I was at a point where if I didn't produce it, I probably was. I mean, I had no personal money at all at that point. And I think I was, my judgment was coloured somewhat. And, I was really inexperienced, and ridiculously arrogant. I thought you could start from scratch, and so.
You got a decent advance on the show?
We had a really I learned.
You had a star.
We had Ruth Maddock, who was the star of Heidi Ho. It was incredibly exciting getting her in the show. So I thought, we've got a star. It'll all be fine, right? Which is so. I think we promoted it well. It was selling tickets really well, and it was the time when Wogan was a big show, and the box office ticking over nicely.
So Wogan was on the BBC One, 7 o'clock, Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Yeah. So we thought, Ruth will go on Wogan, she'll do a song, the box office will go through the roof the next day. And she went on Wogan, she did a song, we hardly sold another ticket. It absolutely destroyed the show, right? And I learned then that that's why when I first started managing artists, I thought when you put somebody on TV, you need to make sure it goes all right, because it's not necessarily all publicity is good publicity. So.
Okay, so chastened by this experience, you turn your back on the musical theatre, and you get into management. Yeah. Yes. And who was your first artist? Who did you first?
Well, my first artist was actually a composer called Steve Brown, who at the time was working on the radio show Radioactive, and that then went on to be on TV, and he wrote for Spitting Image, and he wrote comedy songs, and did a bit of performing, and and one person led to another after that. So.
And we should say that Avalon isn't entirely your baby. It was also Richard Alan Turner.
Yeah, so we started by basically, I took on Steve. The second client was a guy called Richard Thomas, who went on to write Jerry Springer the Opera years later. He was in a double act called Miles and Milner, who were a classical music comedy act. And I thought if I took him on, he'll be able to write for the radio in the way that Steve was writing for the radio. Rich, I then discovered that if you rang up a producer with somebody good, they didn't necessarily employ them. Right? So at the time, we were trying to think how to pay the bills, and I'd heard that you could book comedians into colleges. So I remember phoning up Cardiff University saying, you know, will you book, I'm persuading them to book Miles and Milner. That was the first gig. I think they were paid £400. They rang me the next day. It had gone incredibly well. I thought, this is exciting. Who else have you got? I didn't have anybody else. Right? So I looked at my address book. I found this woman called Sheila Hyde who'd been in Footlights. I had the phone number off, so I put the person on hold, rang Sheila, and said, "Do you fancy a gig?" Right? And that was the beginning of booking live comedy.
So you were able to, you in a sense, then you plug into that Oxbridge Footlights tradition, although you didn't have a sort of arts degree, that has actually been so important to the shaping of British comedy and entertainment. In other words, presumably you had her name in your address book because you were involved with the Footlights at Cambridge.
I had a bit. I mean, I promoted the Footlights outside Cambridge actually, and I knew the people. You know, it was sort of the Fry and Laurie kind of era. And they were a couple of years older, but
okay.
That was the first arena gig that any comic had done in the UK. It had been done in the States. And I think I'm not sure, it was also done in the Round, which I'm not sure anybody else has done since. It was terrifying.
It's interesting that, why did you think it was going to work? Because presumably there was an element of risk in booking. How many seats was that?
10,000.
So that's 10,000.
Yeah.
And they were famous for the Mary Whitehouse experience at that point.
Yes. Well, I was pretty confident that we could sell 10,000 seats. I was, and we'd done 5 nights at Hammersmith, I think, in the previous year. So doing 10,000 seats in one night didn't seem a huge risk. Doing Wembley did seem a huge risk, and you know, we had a lot of conversations about whether it was possible to do arena comedy, but we kind of figured, you know, it might never happen again. Let's see if you can.
And that was arena comedy with a sketch.
Yes.
Which is even more bizarre today to see.
Well, I mean, we did it in the Round because actually the distance between the stage and the seats was no further than Hammersmith at any point. So we couldn't really contemplate the idea of doing an arena at the end. And it seems like everybody does it now. When we did that show, we couldn't put 2 shows on sale, so we only had one chance of it working, and we didn't even know whether people would be able to hear them speak properly, because actually audio is much better now, but then the idea of doing audio in an arena was quite scary, to be honest. So it worked pretty well there, and it was exciting.
And were they did they come to you as a double act, or did you create them as a double act? How did that come about?
Well, I signed David first, and then Rob was looking for an agent, and I signed him second. And they used to do a stand-up show together. I think it was the 2 of them, and Sean Hughes and Mark Lamar. You mean
like a sort of variety bill?
Yeah, variety bill. And then the radio. Well, basically they were approached to create the radio show Mary Whitehouse Experience on Radio 1
as individuals.
Well, yeah, I think David was originally approached, and he sort of said, I would like Rob Newman and Stephen Hugh. So that was how it came together. We didn't put them together. So
they became a double act, as
yes.
it were.
Well, they increasingly worked together, and they used to write together. And they wrote a substantial part of the Mary Whitehouse Experience, and sort of were sort of keen on. You know.
So tell us then, in those days, those are the kind of beginnings of the agency and of you were a management company, but you were also. I don't think you didn't produce the Mary Whitehouse Experience. No. That was the BBC.
It was actually Spitting Image co-production with the BBC.
Right. But you were promoting comedians.
Yeah.
So just give us some insight into how, I mean, use David Baddiel and Rob Newman as an example, how you, as it were, how you managed and built, how you did that? What are the processes involved?
We became a promoter by necessity, actually, in that when we signed artists and brought them to the Edinburgh Festival, I called up a lot of promoters and they wanted to promote the artists. So we did it ourselves, right? So that was the beginning of it. Then,
seems an obvious question, but promotion means booking the hall, does it?
Well, really, producing the show, booking the hall, getting people through the door, you know. So we kind of, when we first came to Edinburgh, there was little publicity for shows. I mean, there were some posters, and there was kind of a sort of, it was much smaller than it is now. But we basically just, well, we were trying to pay the bills, really. So we just did everything we could to try and get an audience for people we liked. So that was how, it was
but again, using those as an example, you could book those guys. So you represented David and Rob and other comedians. You could book them into, presumably...
Well, basically what happened, I mean, what actually happened, when it came with Rob and Davis, what happened was, we'd been promoting, right? We got called up by a guy who works for Phil McIntyre, and Phil McIntyre was then the only, well, apart from Off the Curb, actually, but really Phil McIntyre was the leading promoter of comedy. He'd been a music promoter, and it's pretty tough to make money in music, and he'd realised that basically with comedians he can make quite a big margin on it. And so we got called up by Paul Roberts. He made an offer, I remember, for Rob and David. I haggled incredibly hard. Then I basically went and did the figures and realised that we might as well call Hammersmith as opposed to Phil McIntyre calling, because really there's very little risk in promoting a comedian, because you've got a man and a mic. And there was no point in giving Phil McIntyre half of the money. So that was how we sort of carried, and then we just carried on like that. So we kind of realised that there was more control, but also more money for everybody.
And is that how the television production happened? Was it the same idea of as it were, grabbing more of the value chain?
No, TV was different, right? In that TV was motivated by wanting to get the project on and actually wanted to have good people working on it. So we'd had a lot of people work on in-house shows, and in those days, BBC in-house had a lot of staff members who were kind of, so you'd get a floor manager who'd been there for 20 years, probably shouldn't be there anymore, and it wasn't really constructed in the interest of the show. So our motivation was first to get the project actually on, because we were kind of new, we didn't know anybody, so we were fighting to get our shows on. So the first thing to do was get it financed, and the second thing was we realised that you could, if you started with a blank piece of paper, then you could hire a producer who was appropriate to the show, as opposed to be given a producer who already worked for the company. And that was the basis of it. It was like I was trying to assemble. So when I put Fantasy Football together, I remember thinking, how do you do a sports comedy show? And where are the sports comedy shows? Then Channel 4 Daily existed. There was a guy who used to book comedians to do monologues about sport. And I thought, well, he might be a good producer of a sports comedy show. I rang him up and said, do you fancy doing Fantasy Football? And as it happened, he knew David as well, so Andy Jacob. And so we were sort of, I just believed that if you had an interesting new idea, you had to put people together who were appropriate to the idea, as opposed to the company they worked for. So that's really how it came about. I never thought about the money. It wasn't relevant. People think that, but that wasn't at all the motivation. It was to do with wanting to put on a good show with good people. And you know, one of the things I absolutely believe is putting talented people together is how show business should be run. I think that it's not just the artist, the producer, the director, frankly the executive who commissions it. So we found that you could piece things together more easily with less baggage the way we did it. Okay,
you said at this stage, around this time, you were still relatively new. You didn't know the rest of the industry. Did you have role models? I mean, you'd admired Cameron McIntosh as a producer who you said, his quality, you kind of want to emulate him. But in the world of being an agent or a manager, were the people that you modelled yourself on?
Not really. As I sort of began to learn about it, and
were you conscious?
I admired the grade organisation.
I was going to say, were you conscious of what the grades had a very powerful position in British show business, didn't it? Probably even more powerful than Avalon is today.
Well, definitely more powerful. Let's face it, they owned ITV. They actually owned ITV.
Well, they owned the theatres.
Yeah,
they own the talent.
Yeah.
And they owned part of the
You can't own the talent, David. You can only represent it.
Okay, they represented the talent. But I mean, I'm interested. Were you, the way you describe it, which is, you know, you got into promoting because it was a way of doing it, and you realize why give the money to someone else. I understand that. You got into television because production because you wanted to get ideas on the screen. I'm just. It feels almost like almost accidental, like an improvisation rather than a plan, and yet there were these kind of models, weren't there, of what were then the kind of traditional agents, managers, and so on, like the great organisation, like London Management and so on, to as it were refer to. Richard Armitage had, at Noel Gay, had made a living out of plucking all of the bright people from Oxbridge over the years, hadn't he?
Well, we didn't by design copy a model. We basically were motivated and still are by trying to make things happen that we like. In a way, I sort of see it as sort of trying to create a creative climate for people to operate in, behind which there's a strong business model, so that if something works, they do well out of it. So in doing this, so you're relatively new, you didn't really know anybody, you learn lessons the hard way, I guess. I mean, you have to persuade people to do things, you have to people to buy what you want to buy or back your talent. How do you do that? Well, you persuade them. I mean, you have to learn. It's a selling job, you know. But to be honest, actually, if the talent is great, the selling is relatively easy. It's actually navigated in a way that problems come when you can have a problem where someone, say in those days the Perrier Award was a big thing. If someone won the Perrier, you can have a great plan for them, you know. And we always develop plans for our artists about we were trying to get to here. And
Frank won the Perrier, didn't he?
Yeah, Frank won the Perrier. But what happens when you win the Perrier is suddenly every TV producer under the sun rings up with ideas, lots of which are no good. So you're trying to navigate to success.
I mean, what I'm getting at, John, is that you've got this talent that you believe in. You're still quite a new business, so you're not, as it were, well connected. Yeah, but you believe passionately in this talent. How do you break through? How do you get the breakthrough? And we'll answer that first. Now I've got a follow-up.
Well, call the person who's got the power is the best way.
And do they take the call?
Not initially, no. But I reasonably quickly got to find out that if you went to somebody in BBC Entertainment in-house, you were going to get absolutely nowhere. And because
that's what I'm getting at, John, is that you are, as the new boy, the young guy trying to make his way in the world, you are faced with the old world. And the old world then was still the old world of in-house production at the BBC, the big ITV companies and so on. And it was the great organisation of London Management and all of that generation of agents. Yeah. And they are, you might argue, set in their ways. It's how do you get yourself noticed?
Well, I believe that that part of the reason we promoted our acts live was for that reason. So I found that you could phone every single TV producer and get nowhere. But if you got something written in the papers, so we started doing our own PR at a very early stage because we realised if you can get the press to write about something, then often TV producers would follow what the press would say more than an agent they've not heard of, who's got no power. The power lies with the talent anyway, and I believed that. And I thought that to get somebody noticed, promoting them live. So promoting live was a thing to a certain extent. I thought, well, you know, if the public start going to see somebody, then the industry will follow. If the press come as well, then you create a buzz, and actually people phone then. So we realised that that a big piece in the paper was better than 25 telephone calls to people that didn't really want to hear from you.
Did you get frustrated by the old guard guarding their territory?
Yeah. I mean, I found that.
Did you find that difficult? I mean, I'm thinking of you as a manager, as someone who's trying to get things done.
Yes, I found that extremely well. Partly, in particular, one of my passions is primetime. I loved primetime comedy and entertainment when I grew up. And when we started, I felt it really had come towards, it was coming to probably one of its worst periods, and it was impossible to penetrate, right? Penetrating that area there was no chance. I mean, I remember, you know, Frank Skinner, people would have ideas about why comedians couldn't appear pre-Watershed. And I started to think, this is just so they don't have them on pre-Watershed. So I remember getting Frank on Des O'Connor, which was a pre-Watershed show, and he absolutely stormed it. He had an ability to be on the edge of whatever time slot he was in. But still people would, and I thought, and it couldn't have gone any better. And I think 20 years before, the next day he would have been in prime time. But because I think that the old guard, to a certain extent, controlled primetime entertainment at those days.
You have a reputation for being quite tough, and certainly in the earlier part of your career, you were very direct with people. I was one of the people you were very direct with in various guises. I hope I was appropriately direct back. You can see what I'm getting at, that in a sense this is the new guys facing the kind of established guys, and temperamentally that was quite challenging for you, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, ultimately we were fighting for our talent and to survive in a business where we had no contacts. So, and we had a belief in the shows or the artists we were working with. So it's pretty frustrating when whether you're right or wrong, but if you believe that somebody's good enough to be on a show and you can't get them on the show, or if you're told that this, you know, part of your job is to get people paid well. So if you're told, well, everybody's on £1,000, right, and then you discover that David Liddiment's paid somebody £3,000 and the booker's lied to you, when you've not worked in show business, it doesn't cross your mind that will happen, right? When you start, you believe that people tell the truth, and I found out that people didn't. So I did go a bit ballistic with the odd person.
And that might be an understatement. And when you reflect now, John, on the Jon Thoday then, right? Do you think other moments of regret, or do you think actually that was just an inevitable consequence of the circumstances you were in?
Yeah, I think there are. You learn as you go along. So no one is, and everybody makes mistakes. And I think and that's always true. So I think if you start thinking you're not going to make mistakes, you might as well stop at that point. So do I regret, having a huge row with the guy running Universal DVD because he pulled Rob Newman's DVD deal? Yeah, a bit, but I made a deal with someone else. So the truth is that often people, if you work with, I'm lucky enough to work with great artists, right, and great shows. And if you work with great artists and great shows, then you get to work with great people. And to a certain extent, I mean, I always thought that the aggression thing was a bit overstated, because you could do it a little bit and then it would be blown out of all proportion. And I don't think it was unfounded, necessarily. Now, I'm sure other people might have handled it differently. But if you're fighting to survive... I mean, I remember you said to me once, we were trying to keep TV Burp on the air. And I was this was years later, very frustrated, and to the point of almost giving up. And you said to me, you have to fight. And I think that's to a certain extent true, that to succeed with new television shows or new live shows or new artists, there are times when you have to fight to succeed. And there's an emotion. Sometimes I think aggression can be confused with passion and emotion. I don't believe I'm anything other than passionate and emotional about things I like. I love show business, so I'll do what I can to get people to succeed. And I'm sorry if I shouted at you, David.
I survived. Okay. Reminder there of what a great talent Frank Skinner still is. And is he the client you've represented the longest, or?
David Baddiel, actually. I've represented longer than Frank.
But when you, I mean, both now in a sense of different careers, don't they? That's what must be 20 years, is it?
It's 22 years.
Right. So
it'll be 20 years with Frank on September the 11th.
Right. Well, you know,
we were having lunch 10 years ago as the aeroplane hit the tower. Actually.
Were you?
Yeah.
I'd just like to know a little bit more about, I suppose, the what that means in terms of managing a career, because we know that you know, getting a guy a TV show or booking a tour or whatever is only a dimension of a career. Mm-hmm. Do you sit down with them and plan what they're going to do next? Explain how it works.
With all the artists, certainly that I've worked with, and in general at the company, we sit down relatively frequently and discuss where they want to get to. So you'll say to, I start by saying, what do you want to do, right? And then they say a few things, and if there's something I think is the right direction, I'll kind of encourage for that, and if there's something I think is the wrong direction, I'll say, and then so part of it is a plan, and part of it is not missing opportunities. So you might, with Frank, I think his initial desire was to sell, theatres out and just do stand-up comedy. That's what he wanted to do, and then television called. So essentially, it was a navigation towards something that might be successful on TV, and he's a incredible originator and a brilliant record, fantastic comic. So there were lots of opportunities for him.
But when you're dealing with an originator of ideas and a writer of ideas like Frank Skinner, it's a very different business, is it, than when you're dealing with presenters? I mean, you now have a roster of presenters, famously Adrian and Christine and Daybreak. How do you, I mean, give us some insight into that saga in terms of you as the representative. They were very successful on the BBC, and all of a sudden they find themselves doing a breakfast show on a rival channel. How does that happen?
Well, it wasn't all of a sudden. I mean, essentially that wasn't part of the career plan. There was no. It wasn't part of the plan. Essentially, Adrian came to me and we started representing him. And I remember speaking to him. And he was, the One Show was becoming very successful. He Match of the Day, very successful, and he wanted to have a show that he'd do as well to go with that. And my advice to him was, stay doing the shows you're doing. Let's try and persuade the BBC to do a new show as well. And they offered him the new show, and he had lived with the beginnings of a very difficult show, the One Show, which was its beginnings were incredibly inauspicious, and had lived and breathed it, and it became successful. He established a great relationship with Christine, and I got a phone call from Jay Hunt saying, we don't want Adrian to do Fridays anymore. And Adrian wanted to do Fridays, and it was no more complicated than that. And he felt and interesting enough, it was at a time when talent pay and all that kind of stuff was but it had nothing to do with money. It was to do with he felt it was part of his show, and somebody was coming to say, I don't want you anymore.
But in circumstances like that, John,
I tell you what I did. I tried to persuade Jay Hunt to change her mind.
I was going to say,
for about 9 months.
You stand back from that and you say, this is this guy's meal ticket. He's very successful. He's been there from the beginning. He does it really well. The alternative is a big empty chasm, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think with him, because he hosted the football brilliantly, ITV had been trying to persuade him to do the football for a while, and there'd been a previous negotiation where they'd come in for him, and the decision was to stay at the BBC. Loved doing Match of the Day, loved doing the One Show, and the BBC were going to give him a new show to do. So it was, not difficult, to be honest, to say, stay doing the things you're doing. But unfortunately, there was someone who didn't want him to do that, and so that.
But when the crunch came, is it your call or the client's call when they say, I'm going to walk away then?
It was the client's call, always. You know, the client, you know, you can't tell great artists what to do. You can only advise. And, but I mean, I see it as I really tried to persuade the BBC that to take a show which is really, really successful, with two hosts that are really successful, that was pretty cheap to make, ticked all the nations and regions boxes, and where both of the hosts were prepared to carry on doing it, to take that show and do something which was potentially going to damage it was a mistake, and I failed to persuade. So I don't see, you know.
So the representation of this as basically a complicated manoeuvre to get Adrian and Christine more money is a misreading of the situation. It's
completely a misreading. I mean, like, well, not a misreading, it's not true anyway. So, you know, obviously, if you move to ITV, there are risks involved and you have to get paid a lot of money. But if you stay at the BBC, money follows success anyway. So you're always trying to achieve success for an artist. So, and one of my frustrations sometimes with broadcasters is that the only way for an artist to get paid better is to go and do a new show. Whereas actually, I believe in protecting hits. And I think that the interesting thing about the one show thing is that money wasn't even involved in the discussion. It was just to do with somebody deciding that they didn't like the way it was done. And I think that it's a shame when you've got, I mean, I think that it's very hard to have a hit TV show. And when you've got it, you need to really protect it. Everybody needs to work together. The agent, the producer, it doesn't matter whether agents, producers, everybody, the broadcaster needs to protect the hit. And generally, if you're working with good TV executives, people do that. Occasionally, things get in the way. And that's...
How sustainable is the BBC's talent policy? If what you say is true and that the BBC are kind of keeping a cap on talent pay, and you're saying hit shows are difficult to get and need to be kind of protected and invested in, do you think that's an unsustainable policy on the part of the BBC?
Well, I think they could, you know, the BBC can sustain the policy, but I personally think it will be to the detriment of the TV shows in the end, because you know you only have to see Sky throwing the money around, and artists, you know, panel shows paying £20,000 an appearance or whatever, and you think, well, actually, take something like, you know, Little Britain, great show, two fantastic artists, you know, a big mainstream comedy hit. You want to keep it. You know, that's what the focus should be. Keep the hit, and sometimes keeping a hit involves paying artists more money. But actually, the cost of replacing a hit television show is far, far greater than paying some artists some more money. And I've always believed that it's not what you pay the artists, it's how much the show costs. So if like, for example, I remember Paul O'Grady was on ITV doing a very, very successful 5 o'clock show.
Yeah.
And it was produced by ITVP. He wanted to have his own production company. I believe that they wouldn't give it to him. They wouldn't renegotiate the deal. He went off to Channel 4, and it took them years to replace something which was a revenue generator. The BBC, similarly, if they take a view that someone who has succeeded, who after all may only have a transitory period of their career when they can get paid a lot of money, shouldn't be paid any money, then the chances are that person will go and do a new show. If they go and do a new show, it might be bad for that person. They might get a bit more money then, or a lot more money, because it's easy to pay somebody a lot of money when you start a show, because you're not kind of breaking some accounting rule, whereas the chances are it might not succeed. So that everyone has lost, right? They've broken some kind of financial barrier. They've lost the hit, and the artist has also potentially lost the hit. So I find that the talent pay thing very frustrating, because if you look at the American market, where after all they're very good at being commercial with television, no one has a problem. You know, they fight not to do it, and that's a negotiation, but no one has a problem with paying artists a lot of money when they succeed.
Yeah, America doesn't have the BBC with its particular way of being funded, the particular pressures on it as a public organisation, and obviously it is therefore subject to a different level of scrutiny than a commercial organisation is.
Well, I accept that.
So I feel I should say that as a BBC trustee.
But I think,
the record
but I think people accept that. But I think that sometimes the BBC can be so rigid that, you know, that you could probably say to an artist, I'll pay you 20% more, right, and save millions of pounds, right? But what they'll do is they'll have a committee meeting, decide that no one can have a pay rise, and everything goes wrong, right? And also, as I say, I think it is, you know, it's difficult for the BBC. I mean, because they are damned if they do and damned if they don't, you know.
Thank you all for coming. Can we thank Jon Thoday?